Go ahead. I think that sounds pretty good, huh? Okay, thanks, Peter. Thank you. Hi. Hi. Hope you're feeling better. I know that must have been a lot of fun, huh?
Yeah,
Good to see you. Yeah, I bet. Yes.
Do you want Bibles passed out?
Oh, sure. If you can take a Bible with you, that'd be just grand. And
Hello. Hello, 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 hello. That's your microphone right there. All right. Will you do me a favor and will you go talk up front so I can see if there's any feedback?
yeah. Hi. How you doing? See ya.
I just want to tell you how much I enjoy your teaching.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
One, two, three,
I enjoy
four.
doing it,
One,
and
two,
thanks for
three,
giving the
four.
opportunity.
One, two,
Thank
three,
you.
four.
I
Thanks.
looked it up, and they say Joe was written in the 7th and the 5th century.
Does that sound loud enough,
Right,
Peter?
and
Is that loud enough?
that's a judgment on the basis of literary form mostly, and there's a good chance it's accurate. But you see, it's a period of between the 5th and the 7th centuries. So it's like 1, 2, 3 centuries.
Syrian and Babylonian invasion.
Right, because those things are not referred to there, and it's something about literary style.
But he was, you're live and online.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Maybe I should turn it off for now.
But he wasn't from Judah. He was from.
Well, good morning, folks. We're pleased to welcome Doug Ottati back to the Covenant class, and we'll continue to explore wisdom literature with him in Ecclesiastes and Job, I think. So, Doug, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to be here today. I want to just review a little bit of last time first, and then we'll just go ahead with today. What we tried to do last time was just introduce a category of biblical literature called wisdom literature. It has to do with general human experiences, and it is a form of literature that makes observations about general human experiences, such as, why do bad things happen to good people? I mean, this is like a perennial question, and it's not something that arose only in Israel or anything like that. That's a keeper. Almost any society you go to has that kind of a question, right? And there are other things like that. Why be moral? Or are there different sorts of practices that are helpful? Or are there attitudes that get you into trouble? Things of that sort. Also, what do you make of just accident in history and things like that, and how those things happen to people and to communities? So that form of literature is a pretty generally distributed one in the ancient world. You have Egyptian proverbs and observations and beatitudes, or at least equivalents to them. You have them in Mesopotamia. You have them all over the place. It's not unusual. So when we see this kind of a literature, and you see it in the Bible, you want to understand that it's a kind of reflection that is held in common with a number of other cultures. And in fact, the people who are writing it make use of material from the other cultures. So it's not like it's just cordoned off. You know, there's no giant wall separating off, you know, Israel from everything else and so forth, and there's interchange. So we will see when we get to Ecclesiastes that the author is going to undertake a so-called wisdom investigation, and he is going to investigate different questions with a bunch of different proverbs, not all of which are entirely self-consistent. But he's working with material from different places and perhaps some of his own. Now, when you get to Job, what you have in Job is you have a kind of a sparse narrative beginning and ending to set the stage. And then you have a series of dialogues. The dialogues are where Job's friends make certain observations and he responds. Now, those dialogues are really the substance of the book. It's a little bit like reading some other philosophers who are able to write in dialogue form, though you don't have to worry about reading too many of them that way, because most of them are not sufficiently literary accomplished to do it. But someone like David Hume is and can do it. But it's that kind of a form, so you're seeing the arguments being presented. If you ask which arguments does the writer or writers of these things, which do they endorse, I mean, you can get some kind of an idea out of the book of Job, but it's not immediately apparent. That's part of the point of writing in the dialogue form. The dialogue presents arguments that are present at different times and places. So wisdom literature is a kind of literature. Now, sometimes scholars divide it into a couple of different segments. And it's really just done by thematic things. I hope I don't blow this thing up here. Coming closer. Must be something I'm doing. Okay, so the different sorts. Sometimes you have what scholars call conventional wisdom literature. I've used before Benjamin Franklin's remark, a penny saved is a penny earned, which is not in Proverbs, it's Benjamin Franklin. But a lot of things that Benjamin Franklin said could have been in Proverbs and could have been elsewhere, and so you have that. It's conventional. The idea is if you save a penny, you earn a penny, and in an American society, that's very conventional, right? I mean, it's a commercial capitalist deal. You're supposed to put money in the bank and make money off the money, et cetera, like that. Or if you want, pride comes before a fall, right? Something like that. And that doesn't mean everyone really follows that. You can tell that from contemporary politics and contemporary life if you want to know the truth. But it's a generally sort of understood thing. Now, there's other sorts of literature that some of the scholars call subversive, mostly because it undercuts some of the conventional ideas. And what we're looking at in Job and Ecclesiastes would mostly be classified as subversive wisdom literature. A fair amount of Proverbs would be thought of as conventional, though that's not true of all of Proverbs, and there are many different Proverbs in there, and there are other things going on. So when you get the basic question of the book of Job, which is why do bad things happen to good people, this undercuts a kind of basic sort of aphorism for how to live. If you're good and keep your nose clean, good things happen to you. Well, maybe and maybe not, huh? If you're a moral rogue and terrible bad things happen to you, not necessarily. You might have a great life with all the money and all the fun. These are all possible, and you're going to see that in Job here. So we're looking at wisdom literature. We're looking at two examples of subversive wisdom literature, and we're starting with Job. Last time when we started with Job, we talked a little bit about the introduction to the book and so forth. Suffice to say there that you have a sparse narrative introduction. Once there was a man in the land of Uz. Nobody knows where it is or anything of the sort. It's very much like reading a story to your grandchildren or something that says, once upon a time. Basically it. I wouldn't stay up late at night trying to locate Uz. German scholars have already tried, and anything like that, they've already tried it, but they've not been successful. It has a kind of fairy tale-like beginning and ending. And there you go. What you do find out in the fairy tale-like beginning is that Job is entirely righteous, that he is entirely observant, that he's done nothing wrong, and that basically what has happened is that a divine figure, a heavenly figure, called Hasatan, the prosecutor, has entered into a kind of a bet with the Lord God Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, to say that if the Lord will quit protecting this guy, he will curse God to your face. See? And it's a bet. That's it. It's the only thing that's gone wrong here. So if you take the plot the way it's set up, he's simply victimized by this, right? I mean, that's what's going on. And so you already know before you get going in the book that Job is entirely righteous. And the writers, at least in the final analysis, the final way this was put together, want you to know that. Okay, so then we proceed with what happens here. And, you know, in early chapters, Job's friends show up. They're quiet for a while because Job's in difficult circumstances. A number of people I know, and including a man named William Oglesby, who used to teach pastoral care and so forth in Richmond, would say that that was their best time out when they said nothing. And in fact, if you look through in the book of Job, it'll tell you at the end that that was their best time out when they said nothing. So there is a kind of pastoral lesson there. When bad things happen to people, you know, the most important thing is not necessarily to explain it. It's just to show up, huh? Show up and be there with people. That's more articulate, and not only that, it's probably smarter because it doesn't try to explain it. Huh? There we go. And it is a question of life continuing in community. All right, so we've got that. And then Job responds early on that basically what some of his interlocutors want to say is that God is just and fair, and so if bad things are happening to you, you must have done something wrong. And he's just not having that. He doesn't think that's right, and he keeps responding that it isn't correct. He wants to summon God and have some kind of hearing with God, but that's impossible to do because no one is powerful enough to summon God and bring him to an arbiter. Huh? And so we've got a kind of a problem. And that gets us through some early chapters of Job, and now we're going to go ahead with Job 11 to 42, just going to touch down in some spots. You've got Bibles in front of you. I'm going to hand out, you can just take a look at this and pass it along. It's something from William Blake. It's a portrait of a verse in Job, and we'll talk about it as we go along from the 38th chapter. Okay, so the first exchange between someone called Zophar and Job in chapters 11 to 13 goes something like this. Zophar says that God exacts less than Job's guilt deserves. So if Job is being punished, it's not as much as he ought to be. And if Job directs Job's heart rightly, he will be secure. Now Job says, look, I've got understanding and wisdom too, and this just isn't correct. He says, I, Job, have called upon God, and I'm now a laughing stock. Quote, the tents of robbers are at peace, and those who provoke God are secure. Look, there's a bunch of people here, these jerkazoids, and they're doing fine, and I'm not. So something's not right about what you're telling me here. In 13:3-5, Job says, I desire to argue my case with God. You whitewash with lies. You're just sort of whitewashing this thing and denying the problem. and then says if you would only keep silent, that would be your wisdom, which again was Bill Oglesby's point years ago when I would teach with him occasionally. Again, in that famous line, your maxims are proverbs of ashes in chapter 13, verse 12. That is, your maxims aren't worth anything. They're burnt. They're done. Then Job prays that God will withdraw God's hand from him in 13:2, noting that people are born, live a short while, and die, whereas a tree is cut down and it can sprout again. If you were a bush or something, you'd have a better shot, see? Now, I've noticed this in our garden recently because we've got a wax myrtle in there that my wife didn't like, and so I cut it down. But it's coming back. I mean, it is a keeper. And I like that kind of a plant. I like the kind of plant that keeps coming back because it means you don't have to do much and it'll be there. But she thinks it looks odd, but I think we're going to give it another chance. In any case, it's a general observation. You can cut down a plant and it can be back. You chop off someone's head, that's it, it's over now, okay. So he wants to claim that. The regenerative possibilities are not exactly alike. And then in the 15th to 17th chapter, Eliphaz says, Job is doing away with fear of God and hindering meditation before God. So hurting a kind of religious practice here. Have you sat in the councils of God? Have you been with the divine beings in heaven and so forth? If you haven't done that, you don't really know. What do you understand that is not clear to us? But Job responds, and if you go to chapter 16, first 5 verses, we can see a part of his response there. Then Job answered, I have heard many such things, miserable comforters are you all. Have windy words no limit? Or what provokes you that you keep on talking? I also could talk as you do if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. I could encourage you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. He just thinks this is bull. He's not buying. And when we get to the end of this book, God is going to essentially say, Job has spoken rightly. So, there we are. Then we have some subsequent exchanges here. Zophar's claim in chapter 20, verses 4 to 11, is an important enough claim, and this is that that the exalting of the wicked is short. See, so yeah, it's true the wicked have pretty good time part of the time, but not for long, is the claim. See, and the joy of the godless is but for a moment, and so on and so forth. Now Job's going to answer this, and he's going to answer this in chapter 21, verses 7 to 13. And there's sort of famous lines. Why do the wicked live on, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? Their children are established in their presence. They get good jobs and everything like that. Everything's okay. People are feeling good, right? And their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and no rod of God is upon them. Their bull breeds without fail. Now, on my uncle Richard's farm, that would have been a trick. But okay, that's an important thing. You want a bull who's effective. Their cow calves and never miscarries, also a big deal in an agricultural setting. They send out their little ones like a flock, and their children dance around. They sing to the tambourine and the lyre. They rejoice to the sound of the pipe. They spend their days in prosperity, and in peace they go down to Sheol, the realm of the dead, when they die. But they died nice deaths and so forth. People take care of them. They say to God, leave us alone. We do not desire to know your ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit do we get if we pray to him? So Job's claim is that it's not really true that the wicked rejoice only for a time. Could have a really nice life. I mean, there's nothing that says they're going to get it in the end. If you're hoping for that, you're going to be disappointed at least part of the time. Now, not all of the time, right? I mean, no one's that lucky. But then there's the flip side of the coin. Some people that who do very well and things don't go so well. So, no simple correspondence between virtue and reward. Doesn't happen. In God's world is one of the fundamental things of the book. and no simple correspondence between vice and punishment. Doesn't happen. Okay. Why do the wicked live on, and so forth? And then you've got in the 24th chapter some interesting lines. I mean, we're just picking them out to look at. If you go there, he's going to complain about a number of practices in the world. Why are the times not kept by the Almighty, and why do those who know him never see his days? The wicked remove landmarks, they seize flocks and pasture them. They drive away the donkey of the orphan, they take the widow's ox for a pledge. They thrust the needy off the road, the poor of the earth all hide themselves. Well, this means that the wicked are contravening the law of God, which in Israel includes a special concern for widows and orphans and those who are unable to represent their own interests effectively, and also those who don't have a lot of money. The claim in the Bible, there is no, I think, really elaborate biblical theory of justice. The idea is that some things are fair and some things aren't, and people mostly know. And that the big thing is that if you don't look out, what'll happen is the vulnerable will always be taken advantage of simply because the people with means are able to do it. It's a sort of practical observation about human beings, you see. If you don't have a fair fight, you better look out, see. And if someone has a disproportionate power, they're likely to take advantage of those who don't have it. That's the basic biblical idea there. There are some other things, and of course you can talk about the golden rule, but there's nothing especially biblical about the golden rule. It is biblical, but it's other things too. It's just a notion of fairness, right? What's fair? But the idea then is that in general, how a society treats the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the stranger within its gates, that is, immigrants, are great tests of whether or not a society is just. Because that quartet of the vulnerable, as some biblical scholars call it, is unable to defend its own interests and is easily taken advantage of, you see. Okay, that's the move. And there's some historical things. Israel was, were strangers in Egypt, etc. Okay, so we have this as a kind of idea. When you get to Elihu's discourse, there's the claim that God is great, everything depends on God. If he should take back his spirit to himself and gather himself his breath, all flesh would perish together and all mortals return to dust. Well, this is a reference in part to Genesis 2, where God breathes mouth-to-nose suscitation into the human being, and the human being becomes a living being, and also creates other animals the same way. And so one of the general notions in Hebrew scriptures is that life is a breath from God, or a wind or a breath. See? And when it is withdrawn, then there you go. And you can see how someone would get this sort of idea. I mean, something dies, it stops breathing, right? I mean, this is one of the things that you see. So this is a notion of how life depends upon God, and if God withdraws God's spirit or breath, then the mortals return to dust. So Elihu then says that Job adds rebellion to his sins, and he counsels Job to, quote, remember to extol God's work, a work that no one entirely understands. And he closes by saying, the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power and justice, and abundant righteousness he will not violate. Therefore mortals fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. So this is a kind of an interruption here with Elihu's discourse, but it's an interesting enough thing. And some of the points made there are points that will be made elsewhere in the book. When you get right down to it, you don't really understand what God is up to. That will be one of the big points of the book, and we'll get there. In chapter 31, you're going to see now that we get to the point where Job quits speaking, and then things continue because Elihu will start up again. It starts up, and you got all this stuff. But if we look at 31, we've got in that chapter, Job keeps saying, if I have done, then let this happen to me. But I haven't done it. See? You see a bunch of these conditional clauses. 31:13, if I have rejected the cause of my male or female slaves when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? But he's not done that. If I have withheld anything that the poor desired, in verse 16, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not eaten from it, if I've done, but haven't done any of these things. And the beginning of the book is set up to let you understand that he really hasn't done any of these things. At least that's the literary notion here. And in fact, when his children go out to celebrate, he gets up the next morning and does sacrifices because they might have done something untoward while they were celebrating. I think we have a former president of Davidson College in here. He'll be quite familiar with the phenomenon. That is, if the fraternities and sororities are out there having fun, we don't really know what they did. Maybe the next morning, okay, right? Something like that? Okay, this is what Job has to say there. And then when you get to the end of chapter 31, you'll notice, it's at 38, if my land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together, if I've eaten its yield without payment, or caused the death of its owners. He hasn't done any of these things. And then it says the words of Job are ended. Right? All right. Then after that, you get Elihu, and you don't get God responding to Job till over here in chapter 38. So what most scholars think is that Elihu's discourse was inserted later. See? That there was a time when you would have read continuously from the words of Job are ended to the beginning of chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Doesn't mean that Elihu's discourse is unimportant. It just means it's a latecomer, and this is where it was placed. Okay. You can jump from 31:40 to the words of Job are ended to 38:1-2, and it's kind of fun to do. So then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Very famous line. So the idea here is that Job doesn't know what he's talking about. Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Now, this is precisely the opposite of what Job had in mind. I mean, what Job wanted to do is question God about the fairness or unfairness of what's been happening to him, and that's not what's happening here. Some authors will say, some commentators will say, well, what's going on here is that God is simply pulling rank on Job and sort of oppressing him with stuff. And that, a possible read. I think there's some other possible readings, and we'll get to some of those momentarily. So verses 4-7, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or stretched the line upon it, like a construction worker to get the walls level and so forth. On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. One thing you want to see there is there's a portrait of creation as a kind of construction project, right? And that is one of the images of creation in the Bible, that God constructs an edifice or a tent and so forth. And there are other notions of creation, such as God speaks and something comes about. But then, of course, there's Genesis 2, where God shows up and makes humans and other animals out of dirt, and a number of different images. I'd just like to point that out because I once heard someone say with great authority that there's only one image of creation in Judaism and Christianity, but multiple ones elsewhere. And that's not true. There are multiple images here. Now, why are there multiple images? Let's not make a big deal out of it. It's because you're talking about something that you don't entirely understand, right? I mean, and there are a variety of different ways of doing it. But that's one thing. But the verse I want to concentrate on here is, see, this is, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? The answer is nowhere at all, right? I mean, Job is not. When the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy, which is, this wood print, this is actually a painting from William Blake, from the early 19th century. And so Blake did illustrations of Job in 1826. He did prints and then watercolors in 1806 and 1821. And this is for verse 38:7, when the morning star sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. And there's a depiction of it. So Job is the old guy down here with a beard. God is the old guy up here with a beard. And here are the heavenly beings and the stars, and they're shouting for joy. See, they're happy. And one thing is I always like to ask my students is, why do you suppose they're all happy? And it's because they've been invited to the party of existence. And that's better than not being invited to the party of existence. At least that's the bias. All the world and the universe is created and come into existence, and they're impressed. They like it. They like being rather than not being. There you go. So they're happy. And this is, in fact, one of the major points that God is going to make by pulling rank or not. Namely, you want to know about fairness and so forth, I'm going to tell you about creation. This is going to happen again and again and again here. And we'll see some of the different aspects of that. So what happens then is that God changes the subject. Doesn't really answer the stuff. Actually, God changes the subject. That's a line I first heard from a professor at Duke, Mary McClintock Fulkerson. And just God changes the subject. And I think it's really true here. Rather than discuss whether Job's situation is fair or just, God points to the greatness and ordering of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? When all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. Creation and its orderings and God's governance are presented as works of power and wisdom that sustain. That's one of the things going on here. But that also have threatening dimensions. Those are not shied away from here. So God's works in creation are exalted, they're awe-inspiring, and they're sublime. Job continues in chapter 39, and Job 39 continues the theme. Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? This is a good place to think of those lines because there are really great birds around here, and a number of them are scavengers and birds of prey, if you notice, and they are up higher than the other ones. Sometimes, from a distance, hard to tell the difference between a buzzard and a hawk up there. The buzzards look very streamlined. I mean, it is true we don't like their faces so much because they don't have feathers on them, but that's actually an adaptive strategy, right? So they don't get a bunch of stuff in their feathers. And they may not think we look so great. So in any case, they look really terrific while they're gliding along up there. And of course, they have major powers. And just think about before any airplanes or anything like that. And you see these things, and then bam, they come pick something up because they see it from I don't know how far away. I was walking across the campus at Eaton Seminary one time from between Johnson Hall and the chapel, and all of a sudden this hawk comes down, grabs a squirrel, crunch, and takes off, and there's dinner. It's very impressive, and it's very efficient. And the hawk sees that from way up there. These birds are magnificent, and they fly, and they are doing all this sort of great stuff, and you can see it here. This is a great place to look for that kind of stuff. Okay, and of course, hawks, as it turns out, have certain abilities that we don't, right? I mean, sort of gliding up high and that kind of eyesight, I mean, it's pretty impressive. We have some abilities hawks don't. That's okay. We're not, okay. So we have God changes the subject, starts talking about these things. Then Job answered the Lord in chapter 40, verses 3 to 5. See, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, I will not answer. Twice, but will proceed no further. In 43 to 5. So Job is rendered speechless here. This is a big point being made. God continues then in the 40th chapter, verses 15 to 24, and tells Job, we're to look at Behemoth, which I made just as I made you. Sometimes they think it's, they think it can, what are those things? You go to Africa and they're in the water and they just kick hippos. So they think it could be a hippo. They don't really know, right? So, but one of the fun things about a hippo, if you've ever been to see them, is, you know, they may look kind of funny, but they're pretty fierce. And if they start kicking back like that, you don't want to be there. But in any case, they're very large. And so Behemoth could be a hippo, maybe not, which I made just as I made you. Big deal. So you want to understand your community of what? Being with other animals and so forth. But it is considerably stronger, of course, and more powerful than people are. Indeed, quote, it is the first of the great acts of God. A really wonderful line there, and worth thinking about. In case you were thinking that the only great act of God was the creation of human beings, that is not what's being said here. Only its maker can approach it with the sword. And of course, that's metaphoric. Job 41 then is devoted entirely to Leviathan, which could be a crocodile, another creature people fear and cannot control. And so you get the lines, lay your hands on it, think of the battle, you will not do it again. No one really wants to get in that tussle. Even the gods are overwhelmed at the sight of it. From its mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap out. On earth it has no equal, a creature without fear. It surveys everything that is lofty. It is king over all that are proud. So we have that kind of a line here. Well, these are things that God is pointing to, and you want to see that God's pointing to the magnificence of creation, but God is not pointing to a domesticated creation here. God is pointing to a creation that involves threats and where people are an important element, but they're not the only element. And not everything is simply for their benefit. Huh? I mean, you know, Leviathan, see you later, something like this. You know, this is something that's true in a lot of Hebrew literature and so forth. And you can tell whenever they start talking about the deep and the sea and stuff in there. The Hebrew people are not a great seafaring nation, as it turns out, and they occasionally go fishing, but really mostly think of it as chaos out there. Not like some of my relatives who are Portuguese, you know what they would say, if there had been other worlds, the Portuguese would have found them, meaning that the Portuguese like to get in a ship and go all over the world in the sea. They're happy there, not the Hebrews. This is two different groups, see? Okay. So if you think about the sea, at least from a Hebrew point of view, it's not all just fun and games out there. It's a threat, and you can run into trouble. Okay, so Job then answers the Lord in 42, 2-6. Again, famous lines. Then Job answered the Lord, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Quoting what God had said. Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. In the older translations, I've spoken things too wonderful for me. He's out of his depth. He doesn't really know about this stuff. Hear, and I will speak, I will question you. You declare to me, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Okay, there we go. This is, in other words, Job does not get an answer to how this is fair. God has not claimed, oh, listen, if you'd only considered X, Y, Z, you would see this completely fair and what you deserve. Wrong. It's not happening. Okay, so then we have a kind of closing to this. But before we get there, we might want to just pause and ask, what kind of an experience of God or deity do these passages point to? We'd have to say that in terms of this book, there is a kind of mysterious reality that evokes a sense of awe and majesty. It is what some writers would call in an earlier generation wholly other, entirely unlike what you and I run into. And in important fundamental respects, overpowering and just different. It is an overpowering reality on which we depend and that also fascinates us. A writer named Rudolf Otto, in a book called The Idea of the Holy, said that it is compelling, odd, monstrous, and awe-inspiring. But the word awe is not just A-W-E, it's also A-W, if you will, right? I mean, you can do that too. You want to maybe note the meaning of the word sublime, so I've just included one sentence from the Oxford dictionaries there. Meaning of very great excellence or beauty, producing an overwhelming sense of awe or other high emotion through being vast or grand. I don't know. I suppose one could say that if you go to the Grand Canyon and you get to the edge and look, it's awe-inspiring and it's vast and grand. It's also beautiful. And it's not immediately threatening unless you decide you want to go live down there for a while, then perhaps it is, or climb down there. So you've got a sort of notion here that the deity is wholly other and sublime, and there is awe. See? It's not just a God who walks with you and talks with you. I know that that's one of the default drives of American Protestantism, but it's simply not here. It doesn't mean that God isn't good, but if we're going to talk about how God is good, we need to think about what we mean by that one. We've got all this stuff here. So this is a sort of big deal. One question, I think, is what does the possibility of this sort of an experience indicate about religion? I mean, what's involved in religious devotion? Or about being a human being. You're a human being, but you depend on a bunch of stuff beyond your control. That's life and death, and it's just something that's there. So wisdom literature wants to talk about that sort of stuff. You get asked whether people can still have this kind of an experience in a technological culture where they sometimes have difficult time acknowledging limits. My tendency is to think that they can. I mean, that people have always had difficulty acknowledging limits, which is what Genesis 3-12 is about. And so forth, killing each other and all this sort of business, and building towers to the heavens, to try and claim that they are universal and terrific. Incidentally, some of the commentators on the Tower of Babel claimed that every civilization builds at least this kind of spiritual Tower of Babel, right, to make the claim that it alone has escaped with the universal values. And sound familiar? I grew up 6 miles from a place called the Empire State. And empire is E-M-P-I-R-E. I mean, is this not? When we were kids, my brothers and I thought it was Umpire State because we watched Yankees on TV. It's not what it is. And then there was the Empire State Building, and its basic claim to fame was that it was for a long time the tallest building in the world. And holy smoke! All right, so this sort of stuff. The claim is that people do, I think, have trouble acknowledging limits, and not only that they find difficulties sometimes when they trespass on them, and that there are major contingencies in life, and those are not taken away. We do try to soften the blow. I mean, in a variety of different ways, and you take people in different conditions and then file them somewhere else, and that helps a little bit, I guess, and then you can fly into any place you want to on a plane and get out and look out the window, and if the stewardess doesn't come on and say, "Welcome to Charlotte," how would you know? I mean, well, maybe you saw the skyline, but if you didn't see the skyline, that airport looks about like every other airport when you pull in. I mean, someone's got to tell you where you are. And it's all kind of formicized or something and clean in there and standardized, and there you go. And you think the last thing you're thinking about there is that, well, this could be a little dicey. It's constructed in a certain way, right? Keep you from it. You can be on an interstate highway system, and thank goodness that's standardized, right? You can, and most of the time, and so you can be anywhere in the country, and the same green and white signs, but people get killed on interstate highways all the time. I mean, I know that. Anyway, there are things that don't work out just quite so. And you can think of it when you get on a plane if you like to. Or, I mean, why do they do such a great bar business in airplanes at 30,000 feet? And why are those bars open so early in airports? I mean, there's a reason for that. I'm not against having a drink on a plane. I just don't think it's necessarily going to make you feel like you're going to live forever. I think it's just you might enjoy the drink. Okay, so we have these things here, and you want to see there's a certain experience of the deity here. And it's one that is compelling, but also to a degree troubling. Okay. And this brings us then to the sparse fairy tale-like ending of the book, which then comes here in chapter 42. And it's got a couple of different aspects to it. Job's honesty is vindicated here when the Lord says that Job shall pray for his friends. And you see that right here in verses 7 to 9. So his friends have been wrong, and Job has been right. They have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done. So the claim is, Job has been accurate here. Okay. And the Lord accepts Job's prayer. So that's one thing you got here. And now you got another section, verses 10 to the end, where Job has his fortunes restored and doubled. They're better, see? And, some writers wonder whether that was tacked on because people couldn't stand what was there before. I don't really know. I mean, the other thing is, so what if they did? I mean, it still says Job was right. It wasn't fair, right? Now let's just see what he has here. In the end, it's kind of fun. You'll perhaps see why some scholars think this is not the most profound section of the book, but here we go. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then there came to him all his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. Now you notice it says the Lord brought it upon him. And this is probably their best time out. So they're come talking to him. So this is all good, see? And each of them gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. Okay. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep. That's exactly twice as many as he had before. 6,000 camels rather than 3,000. 1,000 yoke of oxen rather than 500. And 1,000 donkeys rather than 500. Double. See? He's richer. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named the first, and you got the names here. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters. Now he gets new daughters, and they're prettier. And their father gave them an inheritance, and so forth, see? And after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations, and Job died old and full of days, end book. Now, some people read that and say that that means that finally Job is rewarded for all this stuff. I leave you to think it over. I mean, I personally love my daughter, and I think she's beautiful, but I don't know if she's the most beautiful woman in the world. I don't really know that I would feel really great if she died and if she was replaced by a prettier one. But that's perhaps a kind of an idea. It's maybe an ancient idea, but I have an idea that even in the ancient world, you might be feeling a little low and mean about that. So who knows? But that's your book of Job, see? And thought of as subversive literature. Yeah.
Why do you think they added that at the end?
That's very hard to tell.
And do you find it very satisfying ending to the book?
I don't find it particularly satisfying. The part where everyone has dinner with him and stuff is pretty good, right? I mean, I think that works out a little bit like Bill Oglesby, like you should show up, and you should continue life, and I think that's pretty good. I think what a number of scholars think is that was tacked on because of the high tension in the book from before. That may be right. And it's also true that the ending itself says that Job was correct. So I don't know what to say there. If it's meant to say that finally God does reward and everything's fair, then why does it say it's not fair? But it does sort of think that you're compensated by having twice as much of everything. And, you know, there you are. He has the same wife, incidentally. She never dies, right? She's there the way this is set up. So I don't know. I do think that the real action in this book is in the dialogues. And that's where the really important stuff is. The sparse narrative beginning and the sparse narrative ending, they can both be helpful in different ways, if you know it, but they are not the basic substance of the book. The basic substance of the book are the dialogues. And then you get to when God answers and Job is in dialogue with God, and that's the big part of the book. But it's a tough way to go, and it is in the library of the Hebrew Scriptures. But as we now know, in the contemporary period, people are not at ease with everything in libraries. And sometimes they pull books out and do some, but maybe sometimes they add stuff to them too. I don't know. It's not an easy book. It's not an easy get up.
On the last line of the front page, it says, even the gods are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's talking about Behemoth
Right.
and Leviathan. Is
Yeah.
that a reference to a polytheistic past?
Yeah,
Or
well, you know, this interesting thing, like we go around talking about monotheism, polytheism as if they're two entirely different things and never the twain shall meet, but historically that doesn't really work out. A lot of, you know, if you take something like a lot of Greek religion where you have families and Zeus finally is the most prominent of the gods, and then at a certain point maybe he's the only one with completely divine powers, etc. But you can have a pantheon of gods, and that doesn't mean that everything in the pantheon is on a par. And it can be, and then there's a short step from there to saying, well, only one of these is a god, and then the other things are divine beings, etc. And I think you could read years ago from some interpreters saying that the Hebrew Scriptures are, quote, monotheizing literature. They're not entirely monotheistic. And the idea is that there are other powers and divine beings. You see that at the beginning of the book of Job, and you see that also at certain points where you have a plural in reference to God, though it doesn't always mean that just because it's plural. There is no point in Hebrew Scriptures where the Lord of heaven and earth is somehow dependent upon those other powers. And you see that at the beginning of Job too. Hasatan is one of the divine beings, but he can't do anything to Job unless God gives him permission, right? Okay. So, you know, there's more plurality and more at play there than one might think. And the other thing is, some forms of polytheism, they have a whole pantheon, and the pantheon then sets conditions for all the gods. Well, couldn't you say that the set conditions for all the gods are something above the gods? I think some of these distinctions that we've got back there, in terms of history of religions, they're helpful distinctions, but they're not really nearly as absolute as we make them out to be. Well, also pantheism, you know, that you're supposed to have a God that's completely separate from the world and then a God that's in the world. Well, whose religion is this? I don't really understand how that distinction gets made quite that way. And so I think that's also overly done. You could have a pantheistic monotheism. In fact, I think Judeo-Christianity is that kind of thing. That is, God is intimately involved in the world, and it is God's world, et cetera, and is present in the world. And can you be someplace where God is not? I mean, Augustine doesn't think so. If you can't be any place where God is not, does that mean things live and move and have their being with God? Uh-huh. Does that mean that God is also within you? Uh-huh. Does that mean that God is separate from all creation? No. I mean, I think everyone just calm down a little bit about some of these distinctions they got. They'll be better off theologically. There are some differences, and you want to talk about how that goes. Yeah.
A comment as we were listening. Carol Quillen was the former president of Davidson, and she is a literature expert.
Right.
And Carol remarked when she went to Rice that she taught a class for the engineers, who many of whom were not Judeo-Christians.
Right.
There were Muslims and Hindus and so forth. And she went over the classical literature, including the Bible.
Right.
Odyssey, Iliad, so forth and so on. And she said that so many of those students looked at her and said, how can you love a God who is in this Bible?
Sure.
And I think that this is a nice contrarian idea that we have, and we can see it doesn't matter why it was written at the end, but it's a look that gives you hope.
Yeah, I think it gives you hope. The other thing you could say is you go to New Testament passages and you say that God sends rain on the fields of the just and the unjust and sun on, sure, but sometimes too much rain, right? I mean, we have seen that. And I think there's nothing in the New Testament to deny that. So the idea that God is simply sort of a legitimator of everything that we would like to be the case, and that our wants, desires, and interests define the good, that's got one foot on a banana peel. Now, it may be that a lot of people in the contemporary world don't get that because they haven't read the Iliad or they haven't read this. I don't know what they're doing exactly. But none of these classical traditions is really there to tell you that the world is an untroubled thing and that believing in God is an untroubled thing. Now, I can see where that might happen with a bunch of engineers at a certain point, and Carl is kind to say that it was only the engineers. Maybe that, I think, fewer people read things with care in the contemporary world, and that's true even of some people in the humanities, right? It's true even of some people who teach in the humanities. Now, you got problems, and if these texts are not read with care and slowly, in ways that mine some of the stuff out of them, the profundity and the range of the theological tradition is simply going to be lost. Most people think that you believe in God because you want to feel better. Maybe, but not all the time. And it's worth talking about. Yeah.
Doug, Job starts out with the bet between Satan and God.
Yeah.
Doesn't end necessarily with God, bless his heart, saying, na 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 poobah, ha ha, I won.
Doesn't.
So it's not cut and dried. It adds this other that he,
Right.
bequeaths them all this extra stuff.
Yeah, the beginning and the ending are similar in that they're both sparse narratives and fairy tale-like. But it's not entirely clear that the ending is written to be consistent with the beginning, right? So that's just kind of interesting. And I don't know, I mean, in terms of just the literary stuff, it's hard to say that both beginning and ending put together at the same time to be fairy tale-like, because the ending doesn't really address the major question at the beginning with Hasatan, right? So I think that's very, very fair. The book raises a bunch of questions, and one real big question is why a religious community would include this sort of thing in its sacred library. And this is not the only book like this. We're going to get to Ecclesiastes, and there will be some pretty interesting things going on there too. So whatever else is going on with this religious community, it is not trying to get you a God that is domesticated like your pet or something, that's always doing stuff for you. That's not it. Well, big surprise, right? I mean, a God who creates the whole universe isn't just like my pet cat? Yeah, that's right.
I think in a way, this throwing this thing in at the end, where Job gets twice as much as he had in the beginning, just sort of refutes what has been going on, that obeying God or not obeying God, does it equate with material possessions?
Well, that's one of the things that some commentators think, and they think that this ending looks like it was tacked on to alleviate some of the tension, and it surely can be read, in particular by gospel of success people. No one's more effective at reading the end of the book of Job in material terms than a bunch of American Protestants, and read as, everything is materially then satisfied. I do think there are problems with reading it that way. I mean, even if it were intended that way, the stuff about new daughters. But I do want to also say that in addition to that, you see that where it says there that his friends comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. That is something I would like to hear Osteen preach on, okay? Not just more cattle, that. And that goes to the beginning of the book where Job says, you know, shall we accept the good from God and not the evil? Which is also something that Sarah Edwards quoted upon the death of her husband, Jonathan Edwards. Shall we accept the good and not the evil? It's worth sitting to with some of those lines and figuring out what they could mean and why anyone would say them. And that's also in that ending. So look, it's not my favorite thing that he gets twice as many camel, you know? But it's a complicated ending. Even if someone tries to read it as if it were simply giving you more material stuff, it resists that too. And one of the big things is they come and have dinner with him, see, and they comfort him for all the evil that the Lord had done to him. That was one quick thing. We're going to go to Ecclesiastes next time. Take a look at it. It's short. It's really wonderful reading. And I want you to notice that it starts out with, vanity of vanity, says the teacher, all is vanity. And that is the kind of byline for the book. And then he's going to talk about, or whoever wrote it is going to talk about, or they are going to talk about how you might live in a world that includes many vanities. See? Okay, good, thanks.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it. Look forward to next week.
Sure.